There are two kinds of piano player. There's the kind that prefers to read from a score, always have the music in front of them, and there's the kind that prefers to memorize. And of the latter group, there are two kinds of memorizers. There's the accidental memorizer and the intentional memorizer. So accidental, there's overlap with the score reader, because quite often if you read from a score often enough, you start to develop a certain memory for it, mostly muscle memory. But the difference between the score reader and the accidental memorizer is that the accidental memorizer actually prefers to read without the score in front of them eventually, whereas the score reader prefers to always have that music in front of them. There's nothing wrong with that, absolutely nothing wrong with either of those two categories. But what I want to persuade you of today is that even if you never intend to play from memory, you should still aim to become an intentional memorizer, and here's why. As an example, there's a piece of music that I often teach to students. It's Robert Schumann's number 1 from Scenes from Childhood of Foreign Lands and People. And I first learned this piece as a teenager, and I learned it entirely from muscle memory. I couldn't have told you the first note on the page. I knew nothing about it. I just knew that my fingers had learned what to do over lots and lots of repetition. So much so that when I came back to piano playing after a gap of 2 decades, I still knew how to play that piece, except for one section, the middle section, because that section goes through a lot of chord changes. But when I learnt it, even when I was able to play it, I couldn't have told you that it was going through a lot of chord changes. I just knew it was a bunch of notes that didn't seem to have anything in common and were just harder to memorize. Nowadays, when I teach any piece of music, I always ask myself, how can I make this easier for the student to learn? And how would I memorize this myself? And nowadays, when I look at a piece of music like that, it's very obvious to me where the patterns are, what the structure is, and how I could break it into easily learned chunks, rather than trying to memorize it literally one note at a time. So when I do that, I'm relying on a psychological concept called chunking. And what that is a grouping of smaller elements into a coherent, larger whole. So an easy example is if I take 3 different notes, C, E and G, I can think of them as those 3 separate elements, but I can also chunk them into one element, which is the chord of C major. So that makes it easier to remember. It's just one piece of information instead of 3. So nowadays when I look at that 3rd line of Schumann's Of Foreign Lands and People, I don't see 50 notes. I see a series of chords, and I see that each chord has a pattern. 1 chord, down a 5th, up a 4th, down a 5th, up a 4th, down a 5th. It's as clear as day to me now, and it makes it much easier to teach. It makes it much easier for the student to understand and to learn and to memorize. And when they come to play it then, they're not relying on muscle memory. They know exactly what's happening in that line. So they're less likely to make a mistake, they're less likely to have a memory slip at that point. It can also seem like more random elements, like the particular pattern of notes, or just knowing how the melody line moves. And of course, working this way does presuppose some knowledge of music theory, so no primary chords in each key, knowing the scale patterns, arpeggio patterns, intervals. But once you start to see these patterns in music, you'll find them everywhere. So how is this a benefit to you if you prefer to just read from the page? Well, you know that section where you always stumble. I bet if you take the time to look at it closely, you'll find something in it that'll help you to remember as you come up to that point what exactly is going to happen there. That's the place where I move my hand down to a G position. That's the place where those black notes come in. That's the place where my right hand is moving up in 4ths, or there's that strange chord. And you can ask yourself, how would I explain this to somebody else if they didn't really know how to play piano and I had to tell them exactly what to do without touching the keys myself? I couldn't describe it to them note for note. I'd have to find some way of putting information together that makes it easier to understand. And once you're able to explain a piece of music, exactly what's going on in the different parts of it, then you know it well enough to be able to play it in any circumstances. So you're far less likely to get lost in a piece of music. If you understand how the music moves from one idea to the next, you can think ahead and anticipate the moves you need to make along the way. And as you're playing through a piece of music, if you know you're not relying on muscle memory to get you through, you're going to be much more confident in your playing. You're going to have much more mental space to experiment with expression and to really bring out the meaning of the music. And every piece you analyze like that, because that's exactly what you're doing, is going to teach you a little bit more about how music works, so that each subsequent piece is a little bit easier and your musical instincts are just becoming a little bit sharper each time. It becomes a huge boost to your sight reading, because as you start to spot those patterns, you'll be able to read through things more quickly and predict what's going to happen next. So if you're starting on a new piece of music right now, and as I said, even if you never intend to play it from memory, ask yourself, how would I memorize this? How would I explain it to somebody else? How would I teach it to somebody else? And I think you'll start to find that then getting through a piece of music becomes much less hit and miss and much more secure. So I'd love you to give this a go. Let me know what happens. And I'll link to a video here that goes into more depth about how to memorize a piece of music. Give it a go, let me know how you get on, and in the meantime, happy practicing.